There is a silence out there that has no edges. It begins just beyond the thin shell of air that wraps the world, and it does not end. It reaches past the moon, past the cold planets and their slow rings, past the last comet drifting at the frayed border of the sun's influence. And still it continues, on through light years of nearly perfect emptiness, where the distance between one star and the next is so great that light itself, the fastest thing there is, takes years to cross it. The cosmos is mostly this. Mostly dark, mostly quiet, mostly nothing at all. And yet somewhere inside that immense and indifferent stillness, on a small wet planet circling an ordinary star, there is a thing that knows the silence is there. There is something it is like to be here, listening. There is an inside to the universe, at least in this one warm corner of it, and that small fact may be the strangest thing the cosmos has ever produced. Consider, for a moment, how alone that inside seems to be. The light of our own star, the sun, takes a little more than 8 minutes to cross the distance to the Earth, racing across some 93 million miles of empty space to fall, at last, on a closing eye. That is the nearest star, the one whose warmth we live by, and even it is 8 minutes away at the greatest speed there is. The next nearest star after the sun, a small, dim red ember called Proxima Centauri, lies more than 4 light-years off, which is to say that its light, setting out tonight, will not arrive until you are 4 years older. And the space between here and there is, for all practical purposes, perfectly empty, perfectly cold, perfectly dark. Our whole galaxy, the great slow pinwheel of the Milky Way, stretches across something like 100,000 light-years. And our sun, with its small family of worlds, drifts out near one of its quieter edges, some 26,000 light-years from the bright crowded center, taking more than 200 million years to complete a single lazy circuit of the galactic wheel. And the Milky Way itself is only one galaxy among a number too large to feel, scattered across distances that strain even the patient language of astronomy. The nearest large galaxy to our own, the great spiral of Andromeda, hangs more than 2.5 million light-years away. Its light reaching us now, having left before our own kind of human being existed. Beyond it, galaxies upon galaxies recede into the dark, fainter and farther and older, until the eye and the instrument alike give out, and still it goes on. This is the setting in which the small, warm fact of consciousness finds itself, an immensity almost entirely without warmth, without light, and on the ordinary account, without any trace of an inner life, across which a handful of feeling creatures are scattered so thinly that they may, for all we know, be utterly alone. To wonder whether mind might run deeper than this, might be threaded somehow through the vast, cold structure itself, is to wonder whether the loneliness is real, or only apparent, only a story we have told ourselves about a universe whose inside we have never been able to see. For most of the history of science, the standard story has been a simple and rather lonely one. The universe began without mind. It was matter and energy and force, governed by laws that cared for nothing because they were not the kind of thing that could care. Stars formed, burned, and died. Atoms gathered into rock and water, and after a very long time into living cells, and those cells, after a longer time still, arranged themselves into nervous systems complex enough that, somewhere along the way, the lights came on, experience appeared, feeling appeared. The universe, after billions of years of being entirely in the dark, woke up in small, scattered places and began, faintly, to look back at itself. On this account, Consciousness is a latecomer, a rare and recent flame, lit only where the wiring grows intricate enough, surrounded on all sides by a vast, unfeeling dark. But there is another story. It is older than science, has never quite gone away, and in recent decades, a small but serious group of philosophers and a few scientists have begun to take it seriously again, not as mysticism, but as a careful proposal about the nature of things. The story goes like this. Perhaps consciousness was not a latecomer at all. Perhaps it was not switched on late in the history of the universe by some lucky arrangement of nerve cells. Perhaps mind, in some unimaginably faint and simple form, was woven into the world from the very beginning, present in the atoms of the first stars, present in every particle that has ever drifted through the dark, a fundamental feature of reality as basic as mass or charge, or the curve of space around a heavy thing. On this view, the universe did not wake up in us. The universe was never wholly asleep. That idea has a name. It is called panpsychism, from two ancient Greek words, pan meaning all and psyche, meaning soul or mind. And whatever one finally decides about it, and there are very good reasons to be cautious, it is worth following slowly into the dark, because the path it takes runs straight through the deepest questions we have about what stars are made of, what matter really is beneath the equations, and why there should be anything it is like to exist at all. Let us begin gently, with what the word actually means, because it is easy to misunderstand, and the misunderstandings are mostly more foolish than the thing itself. Panpsychism, as philosophers use the term today, is the view that mind, or consciousness, is a fundamental and widespread feature of the natural world. It is the doctrine that the mind is not a rare local accident, but something that exists, in some form, throughout the universe. Each of those words carries weight, and each has been argued over for a very long time, so it helps to take them apart slowly. To say that the mind is fundamental is to say that it is not built out of anything simpler, not assembled from parts that are themselves mindless, but is instead one of the basic ingredients of reality, sitting at the bottom of things alongside the properties that physics already recognizes. And to say that the mind is widespread or ubiquitous is to say that it is not confined to brains, that some trace of it reaches down into the simplest constituents of matter, into the particles and fields from which everything larger is made. Now, this is the point at which the idea is most often misheard, and so it is worth pausing on. The panpsychist is not, in any serious version, claiming that a rock broods over its troubles, or that an electron has hopes and regrets, or that your coffee cup is quietly thinking about you while you sleep. That caricature is easy to laugh at, and it has been laughed at often, but it is not what careful proponents of the view have in mind. The kinds of experience attributed to a star or a particle, if the word experience can even be stretched that far, would be so simple, so dim, so utterly without thought or memory or self, that calling it consciousness in the human sense badly overstates it. Human consciousness is an extraordinarily rich thing. It has color and sound and the taste of things. It has the feeling of a body and the weight of a mood. It has a sense of self moving through time. A horse, most would agree, has something less rich than this. A mouse, less again. A worm, less still. The panpsychist simply asks what happens if that fading continues all the way down, through the simplest living things and past them, until what remains at the level of a single particle is nothing, but only the very faintest spark of inwardness, a flicker so basic that it bears almost no resemblance to anything we would recognize as a mind. Because of this, many philosophers prefer a more careful term. They speak of panpsychism, the view that experience, rather than full-blown consciousness, is the fundamental and widespread thing, and they often reach for the most minimal definition of experience available, one that has become a kind of touchstone in this part of philosophy. A thing has experience, on this definition. If there is something it is like to be that thing, there is something it is like to be you, sitting in the dark, hearing these words. There was, presumably, nothing it was like to be the empty space those words traveled through to reach you. The whole question of panpsychism can be put as a single quiet wondering. How far down does the something it is like to be go? Does it stop at the brain, at living things, or does some trace of it go all the way to the bottom, to the small cold facts from which the stars themselves are built? It helps, too, to set the view apart from a few of its neighbors, with which it is easily confused. Panpsychism is not pantheism, the idea that the universe as a whole is God or is divine. It makes no claim about gods at all, and a committed atheist can hold it without strain. It is not animism in the old folk sense, the personifying of rivers and mountains, and storms as spirits with human-like wills and intentions. The experience the panpsychist attributes to a particle has no will, no intention, no personality whatever, nothing that could be prayed to or bargained with, and it is not quite the same as the old hylozoism we met among the Greeks, the doctrine that all matter is alive. For life is a particular and complicated achievement of certain physical systems, with its metabolism and its reproduction. And the panpsychist need not say that an electron is alive any more than a careful critic need say that a thermostat is wise. What the panpsychist claims is narrower and stranger and harder to dismiss than any of these. Not that the particle is divine, not that it is alive, not that it wants anything, but only that there is some faint flicker of experience to it, some dim inward aspect, some barely there sense in which it is like something rather than nothing to be that particle. That is a far more modest claim than the caricatures, and also, in its way, a far more unsettling one, because modesty is harder to laugh off. It is important to be honest from the start. Panpsychism is a minority view. Most philosophers do not accept it, and most scientists who think about consciousness do not accept it, and some of them regard it as not merely false, but faintly ridiculous. We will come, later and carefully, to their objections, because they are strong and they deserve a fair hearing. But the view is not held by cranks. It has been defended in recent years in the pages of serious philosophy journals and by professors at respected universities, and it has, as we shall see, a long and surprisingly distinguished history. It is, at the very least, an idea that has earned the right to be considered slowly. For it is an old idea, older than telescopes, older than the very notion that the stars are other suns. When the first Greek thinkers began, some 26 centuries ago, to ask what the world was made of and to answer without reaching for the gods of the old stories, they did not draw the sharp line we now draw between dead matter and living mind. Thales of Miletus, often called the first philosopher in the Western tradition, is reported by Aristotle to have held that all things are full of gods, and to have thought that even a lodestone, a piece of iron-bearing rock that draws metal toward it, must possess a kind of soul, because it had the power to move other things. To Thales and those who followed him, the world was not a machine with a few living parts. It was alive through and through, animated, charged with some inner principle of movement and change. Anaximenes thought that the principle was air, the breath that holds the cosmos together as breath holds together a living body. Heraclitus saw it in fire, the ever-living flame that is the same in all things, kindling and going out by measure. This early instinct, that matter and life and mind are not three separate kingdoms, but one continuous fabric, has its own name in the history of thought. It is sometimes called hylozoism, from the Greek words for matter and life, the doctrine that all matter is in some sense alive. It runs through the Stoic philosophers, who pictured the entire universe as a single living being, held together and ordered by a rational principle they called the logos, a kind of cosmic intelligence diffused like a warm breath through every part of the whole. The same intuition lifts into one of the most beautiful images in all of ancient thought, the world soul, the anima mundi, which Plato describes in his dialogue, the Timaeus. There, Plato writes of the cosmos as a living creature, fashioned with soul and intelligence, its body the visible heavens, its soul woven through the whole of it and binding it into one. The planets turning in their courses were, in this picture, the movements of a vast living thing, and the order we see in the night sky was the visible trace of an inner life as real as our own. That image proved long-lived. It passed from the Stoics to the Neoplatonists, who set the world-soul partway between pure spirit and gross matter, a bridge between the one and the many. It slept through much of the Middle Ages and woke again in the Renaissance, when thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno spoke once more of a soul running through all of nature. And Bruno wrote that there is nothing that does not possess a soul and an inner vital principle. It was in this period, the late 16th century, that the Italian philosopher Francesco Patrizzi actually coined the word we are following, panpsychism, to name this ancient conviction that mind is everywhere. And it did not end there. In the 17th century, two of the towering figures of philosophy gave it careful and rigorous form. Spinoza held that mind and matter are not two different substances, but two aspects of one single reality, so that everything that is extended in space also has, on its inner side, a corresponding mental aspect. And Leibniz built his entire system out of what he called monads, simple mind-like units of reality, each one a tiny center of perception, the whole universe composed of these and nothing else. In the world that physics was just beginning to describe with such force, Leibniz quietly insisted that beneath the moving parts, there were these countless small interiors, dreaming or waking by degrees. Nor did the thread break with the 17th century. In the 19th, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer offered one of the boldest versions of the intuition, arguing that the inner nature of all things, the reality behind the appearances that physics measures, is what he called will, a blind striving urge present in everything, in the falling of a stone toward the earth as much as in the longing of a living creature, so that the whole world was, on its hidden side, a single restless wanting. Around the same time, Gustav Fechner, a careful experimental scientist who helped found the measurement of sensation in psychology, became one of the most ardent and tender defenders of the view, holding that plants have an inner life of their own, that even the earth itself might be a great ensouled being, and that the heavenly bodies turning overhead were not dead lamps but living things. That last thought was carried into the 20th century by the American philosopher Josiah Royce, who likewise entertained the idea that the stars and planets possess souls of their own, vast, slow minds, keeping their own counsel across the long turning of the years, and the American psychologist and philosopher William James, the most humane and exploratory of thinkers, took panpsychism seriously to the end of his life, drawn by the difficulty of seeing how mere mechanism could ever feel. Perhaps the most rigorous of these later figures was Alfred North Whitehead, the mathematician and philosopher who, in the early decades of the 20th century, built an entire system, sometimes called process philosophy, in which the basic units of reality are not lifeless bits of matter but momentary events, each one a kind of happening that gathers up its world in what he called apprehension, a faint taking account, a dim feeling toward, so that the universe at its root is composed not of dead stuff, but of countless small experiential occasions, flickering into being and passing away. To Whitehead, to feel, in this minimal sense, was simply what it was to be an actual thing at all. So the idea is not new. It is one of the oldest answers humanity has given to the question of where the mind belongs in the scheme of things. What is new, what has happened only in the last few decades, is that this ancient intuition has been picked up again by careful analytic philosophers and pressed back into service for a very modern reason. And to understand that reason, we have to understand the particular problem it is now being asked to solve, a problem that sits, unsolved, right at the center of our science of the mind. It has come to be called the hard problem of consciousness. The phrase belongs to the Australian philosopher David Chalmers, who introduced it in the mid-1990s and watched it take hold across the field with surprising speed. To see what the hard problem is, it helps first to see what it is not. And so Chalmers drew a line between two kinds of questions we might ask about the mind. On one side, he placed what he called, with some irony, the easy problems. These are the problems of explaining what the brain does. How does the brain take in light and sound and sort it, telling red from green, near from far? How does it gather scattered information together and act on it, steering the body toward food and away from danger? How does it store a memory, focus attention, produce the words of a sentence, and report on its own inner states? These problems are not easy in any ordinary sense. They are enormously difficult, and we are nowhere near solving all of them. But Chalmers called them easy because we at least understand what kind of answer would count. In principle, for each of these abilities, we can hope to find the mechanism, the chain of physical cause and effect in the wet machinery of the nervous system that performs the function. There are problems about doing, about behavior and processing, and physical science knows, at least in outline, how to chase such problems down. And then, set apart from all of these, there is the other question, the one Chalmers called hard. Why is any of this accompanied by experience at all? Why is it that when light of a certain wavelength strikes the eye, and the signal travels inward, and the brain does whatever it does, there is, in addition to all that processing, the actual felt redness of red? Why is there a taste to coffee, a sting to cold water, and ache to grief? In principle, it seems, all the processing could go on in the dark. A system could take in light, sort it, respond to it, even talk about it, and there might be no one home, nothing it was like to be that system, just a mechanism unfolding in the silence. That such systems do not, in our own case, run in the dark, that there is, in fact, a felt quality to our inner life, is the deepest puzzle there is. The technical word for these felt qualities, the redness, the saltiness, and the ache, is qualia, and the philosopher Thomas Nagel had captured the same mystery a couple of decades earlier in a famous phrase, when he asked what it is like to be a bat. and pointed out that no amount of knowledge about a bat's brain and its sonar seems to tell us what the world feels like from the inside of that small flying life. There is something it is like to be a bat, presumably, and we cannot get at it from the outside, no matter how complete our physics. Nagel's choice of a bat was deliberate and gentle. He did not pick a creature so alien that we could not believe it conscious at all, nor one so like us that we could simply imagine ourselves into it. He picked a fellow mammal, warm-blooded and familiar in its way, that nonetheless lives by a sense we do not possess, navigating the dark by throwing out cries and listening to the echoes, building a world out of sound the way we build one out of light. We can learn everything there is to know about how that sonar works, every detail of the bat's ears and brain, and still it seems we would not thereby know what it is like, from the inside, to perceive the world as a shifting landscape of echoes. The facts about the mechanism, however complete, leave a residue, and the residue is precisely the felt character of the experience, the very thing we most wanted explained. This residue has a name among philosophers. They call it the explanatory gap, the gap between any account of what the brain does and any account of what it is like to be the brain doing it. The whole drama of the hard problem lives in that gap. The physicalist hopes the gap will close as our science matures, that it is a gap in our knowledge and not in the world. The panpsychist suspects the gap will never close from that direction, because the felt character was never going to be derived from structure and function alone, and must instead be there at the foundations, written into matter from the start. It is the same gap, seen with hope from one side and with resignation from the other. This is the gap that haunts the science of the mind. We can describe, in ever finer detail, what happens in the brain. We can map which cells fire when a person sees a color or feels pain. But mapping the machinery does not seem, on its own, to explain why the machinery is felt, why there is an experience and not merely a process. Some philosophers think this gap is real and deep, and tells us something true about the world. Others think it is an illusion, a confusion that will dissolve once we understand the brain well enough. Chalmers himself once noted that, when he put the question to audiences, something like a third of people felt that explaining the brain's functions would explain everything there was to explain, and the remaining two-thirds felt that even then, a further question, the hard one, would still be standing there unanswered. The disagreement is genuine, and it runs deep, and it is worth holding both responses gently in mind, because the whole appeal of panpsychism rests on taking the hard problem seriously. If you think there is no hard problem, that consciousness is just what certain kinds of information processing look like from the inside, and nothing more needs saying, then you will feel no pull toward the strange old idea that the stars might faintly feel. But if you think the gap is real, that there is something about felt experience that ordinary physical explanation keeps failing to capture, then you have a problem on your hands, and panpsychism presents itself, quietly, as one possible way out. To see why, consider the landscape of possible answers, the way these philosophers lay it out. Faced with the hard problem, you have, broadly, three roads you might take. The first road is the one most of modern science travels, and it is called physicalism, or sometimes materialism. On this view, the world is, at bottom, entirely physical. There is nothing in reality but matter and energy, and the structures they form, all of it governed by the laws of physics. And consciousness, whatever it turns out to be, must somehow be a part of this physical world, perhaps just a very complex pattern of physical activity in the brain. This is a clean and unified picture. It asks us to believe in only one kind of thing. Its difficulty is precisely the hard problem. However complex the physical activity in a brain, it remains, on the face of it, just physical activity, things pushing and pulling on other things, and it is genuinely puzzling how mere pushing and pulling, however intricate, could ever amount to the felt warmth of a sunlit afternoon. The physicalist owes us an account of how feeling arises from the unfeeling, and after a great deal of effort, that account has proven remarkably hard to give. The second road is dualism, the view associated above all with Descartes in the 17th century. On this view, mind and matter really are two fundamentally different kinds of thing. There is physical stuff, with its size and shape and motion, and there is mental stuff, with its thoughts and feelings, and the two are simply distinct. Dualism has the virtue of taking consciousness seriously, of not pretending the felt quality of experience can be reduced to mechanism. But it pays a heavy price. It leaves us with a universe split down the middle, two kinds of substance that have nothing in common. And then it faces the maddening question of how they could possibly interact. How could an immaterial mind, with no mass and no location, reach into the physical brain and nudge a single atom? And how could the physical brain, all chemistry and electricity, ever touch the immaterial mind? The two realms seem sealed off from one another, and yet plainly, in us, they meet. Dualism never solved this, and most philosophers have set it aside, not because it is obviously false, but because the disunity it leaves us with feels like a confession of defeat rather than an explanation. There is, too, a quieter discomfort with the dualist's picture, one that grows sharper the wider you let your gaze travel. If the mind is a separate substance, added to the physical world from somewhere outside it, then we must ask where, in the long history of the cosmos, that second substance entered the story. For most of the life of the universe, on the dualist's own account, there was only matter, vast clouds of it, wheeling and cooling and clumping into stars, with no mind anywhere among it. Then, at some point, on some warm and watered world, the second substance arrived, attaching itself to certain arrangements of the first. But when and how and from where? The dualist has no comfortable answer. The mental realm cannot easily have evolved, for it is not physical, and so is not subject to the slow shaping of selection. It seems simply to have appeared fully strange, like a guest who walks into a house through no door. Some have spoken of it, a little mockingly, as the ghost in the machine, this immaterial mind supposed to haunt the bodily mechanism, pulling levers it cannot touch. And when we lift our eyes from the single body to the whole sweep of the heavens, the difficulty only deepens. A universe that is purely physical for 13 billion years, and then, in one small corner, suddenly admits a wholly different kind of being into itself, is a universe with a seam in it, a place where the fabric was cut and something foreign stitched in. The panpsychist and the physicalist, for all their disagreement, at least agree in refusing that seam. They want a universe of one cloth, whatever that cloth turns out to be. The dualist's two worlds, joined at a mysterious hidden hinge, ask us to believe that reality is, at its root, divided against itself. It is this above all, this loss of the world's unity, that has made so many thinkers reluctant to take the second road. However honestly it honors the strangeness of the mind. And then there is the third road, the one we are following. The panpsychist suggests that the trouble with both of the other roads is that they begin with the same hidden assumption, the assumption that matter in itself is entirely without mind. The physicalist takes mindless matter and then struggles and fails to squeeze consciousness out of it. The dualist takes mindless matter and then, in despair of squeezing mind out of it, adds a second separate realm of mind and cannot connect the two. But what if the shared assumption is the mistake? What if matter was never wholly mindless to begin with? Then there would be no need to conjure consciousness out of nothing, because it would have been there all along, in faint and simple form, threaded through the physical world. And there would be no need for two separate substances, because there would be only one kind of stuff, physical and experiential at once, the outside and the inside of a single reality. Panpsychism presents itself, in this way, as a middle path. It promises to take consciousness as seriously as the dualist does, while keeping the single, unified world that the physicalist rightly loves. Whether it can actually deliver on that promise is another matter, and we will test it. But the shape of the offer is clear, and it is genuinely elegant, and that elegance is much of why the idea has come back. It is worth pausing to feel the size of what is at stake in choosing among these three roads, because it is easy to mistake this for a narrow technical quarrel among specialists, and it is not. The question is, at bottom, whether the universe that produced us is the kind of place that has insides or only outsides. On the first road, the road of strict physicalism in its most deflationary form, there is, in the deepest sense, no special fact about feeling at all. There is only matter doing what matter does, and our conviction that something more is going on is a kind of trick the brain plays on itself. On the third road, the road we are walking, feeling is not a trick, but a clue, the one place where the universe shows us its inner face, and the project becomes one of following that clue down into the structure of matter itself. The same dark sky overhead means something very different depending on which road is true. On the one hand, it is a vast machine grinding through its motions, and our wonder at it is a local accident, a sentiment with no echo in the thing observed. On the other hand, our wonder is the universe wondering, and the looking up is, in some small way, the cosmos turning a part of itself back toward the rest. Nothing in the night sky will tell us which it is. The photons arriving from the distant stars carry information about temperature, motion, and chemistry, and not one word about whether anyone is home. And so, the choice among the roads cannot be made by the telescope. It must be made, if it can be made at all, by patient argument, by weighing which picture leaves the fewest mysteries unaccounted for, and by a kind of honesty about how little, in the end, we know. Now we arrive at the part of the story where philosophy of mind reaches out and takes the hand of physics, and where the question of consciousness becomes, unexpectedly, a question about the nature of stars and atoms and the deep structure of the material world. This is the heart of the modern case, and it turns on a single, subtle, and rather beautiful point about what physics actually tells us. Consider what we know about any physical thing. Take an electron, that tiny constituent of every atom in your body and every atom in the sun. Physics describes the electron with great precision. It tells us the electron has a certain mass, a certain electric charge, and a property called spin. But notice what these descriptions actually amount to when you look at them closely. Mass is a measure of how a thing resists being pushed, and how strongly it pulls on other things through gravity. Charge is a measure of how a thing pushes and pulls on other charged things. Spin describes how a thing behaves in a magnetic field. Every one of these properties, when you unfold it, turns out to be a description of what the electron does, how it relates to other things, how it moves and is moved, how it affects its neighbors. Physics gives us, with extraordinary accuracy, the structure of the world and its dynamics, the pattern of relations, and the rules by which that pattern changes over time. It tells us how matter behaves. But here is the strange thing, the point that a number of thinkers have circled for 100 years. Physics never quite tells us what matter is. It tells us what matter does, exhaustively, but the doing seems to presuppose a doer, and about the intrinsic nature of that doer, the thing in itself that is doing all this relating and behaving, physics falls silent. It describes the electron entirely in terms of its effects on other things, which are themselves described in terms of their effects, and so on, around and around. A vast web of relations in which everything is defined by how it relates to everything else. And nowhere does the chain bottom out in a description of what any of it is, intrinsically, on its own. This idea has a distinguished pedigree. It was given its sharpest early statement by the philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell in a book published in 1927 called The Analysis of Matter. Russell had spent years steeped in the new physics, in relativity and the beginnings of quantum theory, and he came to a striking conclusion. Physics, he argued, is mathematical not because we know so much about the physical world, but because we know so little. It is only the mathematical, structural properties of things that physics can reach. The equations capture the pattern, the relations, and the structure, and they capture it magnificently. But the equations are silent about the inner character of whatever it is that has this structure. We know how the world is arranged and how the arrangement changes. We do not know, from physics, the nature of the things arranged. There is a way of putting this that makes the strangeness easier to feel. Imagine a description of the world written entirely in verbs, with no nouns at all. It would tell us, with perfect precision, what is attracting and repelling, what is accelerating and bending and spinning, what is causing what to do what. It would capture every relation and every change. And yet, it would never once tell us what any of the things doing all this were, in themselves, apart from their doings. Physics, on this reading, is exactly such a description. It is a vast and flawless account of behavior, of how the contents of the universe relate to and affect one another. And it is, by its very method, silent about the inner character of those contents. Or think of it as a map of immense detail, marking every road and river, and the precise distances between all the towns. A map so complete that you could find your way anywhere by it. Such a map would tell you everything about how the places stand in relation to one another, and nothing whatever about what it is like to actually stand in any of those places, to feel the wind there, to be there from the inside. Physics is the map. The territory, the intrinsic what it is of the places marked, lies outside what any map can show. Schopenhauer, in his own way, had felt this gap a century before Russell named it, and had filled it with his blind, cosmic will. Russell filled it with nothing, leaving it an honest blank, and the Russellian monist proposes, very carefully, to fill it with experience. Philosophers have given this gap a memorable name. They speak of the intrinsic nature of matter, the what it is in itself, as opposed to the relational or structural properties, the what it does. And the view built on Russell's insight is called, in his honor, Russellian monism. It begins from this thought. Physics describes only structure and dynamics. It leaves the intrinsic nature of the physical world entirely open, a blank that the equations cannot fill. And then it asks a question that, once asked, is difficult to unhear. We do, in fact, know of one piece of intrinsic nature. We know of one place in all the universe where we have access, not just to how something behaves from the outside, but to what it is like on the inside. That place is our own consciousness. When you feel the warmth of the sun or the ache of sadness, you are not observing your own brain from the outside, measuring its mass and charge. You are living the intrinsic nature of a piece of the physical world from within. Your experience is what a certain region of matter is like on its inner side. And so, the Russellian monist makes a bold and economical proposal. Physics has left a hole in its picture of the world, the hole where the intrinsic nature of matter should be. And consciousness is the one example we have of intrinsic nature. So why not suppose that they are the same? Why not suppose that the intrinsic nature of matter, the what it, is that physics cannot reach, just as some form of experience? On this view, the equations of physics describe the outside of the world, and experience is its inside, and they are not two things but one thing seen two ways. The electron's mass and charge are how it appears in the web of relations. Its faint, simple, almost unimaginable experience is what it is in itself. This is the modern, scientifically literate form of panpsychism, and you can see how cleanly it slots into the gap. It does not contradict physics. It accepts every equation, every measurement, every prediction. It only proposes to fill the silence that physics itself leaves, the silence about intrinsic nature, with the one ingredient we know firsthand to exist. It is a remarkable thought to sit with on a dark night. Everything you can see in the sky, every star, every drifting cloud of gas lit by the stars behind it, every world, is described by physics purely in terms of structure and relation, mass and motion and force. We have built an astonishing science on that structural description, mapping the universe out to its farthest visible reaches. And yet, if Russell was right, all of that magnificent knowledge is knowledge of the outside of things, the pattern and never the substance, the shadow on the wall and never the figure that casts it, the intrinsic nature of the stars, what they are when no relation is being measured, would remain, on this view, entirely outside the reach of the telescope, a matter on which all our physics is, and must be, silent. It is worth lingering here on a particular figure, because he stands at the exact crossing point of astronomy and this strange idea, and his life makes the whole question feel less abstract. His name was Arthur Stanley Eddington, and he was one of the great astronomers of the early 20th century. It was Eddington who, in 1919, led an expedition to the island of Principe off the coast of West Africa to observe a total eclipse of the sun, and who measured there the way the light of distant stars was bent as it passed close to the darkened sun, confirming Einstein's prediction that gravity curves the very space through which light travels. That measurement made Einstein famous overnight and stands as one of the most beautiful experiments in the history of science, a moment when the abstract geometry of relativity was caught in the act. Written in starlight across the sky, Eddington also did foundational work on the inner life of stars, on how they hold themselves up against their own crushing gravity, on the physics of the furnaces burning in their cores. He was, by any measure, a hard scientist, a master of the structural, mathematical description of the cosmos. And yet Eddington, having spent his life reading the structure of the heavens, came to a conclusion that startles many who first encounter it. In his book, The Nature of the Physical World, drawn from lectures he gave in the late 1920s, he wrote that the methods of physics lead us not to a concrete reality, but to what he called a shadow world of symbols, a web of mathematical relations beneath which those methods cannot penetrate. Physics, he insisted, gives us the structure and never the substance. And then, with the caution of a man choosing strange words carefully, he ventured a guess about what that hidden substance might be. To put the conclusion crudely, he wrote, "The stuff of the world is mind stuff." He did not mean that the stars think as we think. He went out of his way to say that by mind he did not quite mean mind, and by stuff he did not at all mean stuff, that he was reaching for something for which language was barely adequate, but his thought was clear enough in outline. The one thing we know directly, without inference, is the character of our own minds. Everything else, all the matter and motion of physics, we know only at a remove, as structure read off from instruments. And so Eddington proposed, tentatively, that the substratum of the whole world, the intrinsic nature beneath the structural symbols, might be of the same general character as mind. He was not alone among the physicists of his generation in such musings. His contemporary, James Jeans, another distinguished astronomer, wrote in the same period that the stream of modern knowledge was heading toward a reality that looked less and less like a great machine and more like a great thought. Eddington had a way of dramatizing the point that is worth dwelling on, because it comes from a man who had spent his nights at the eyepiece and his days at the equations, and who therefore knew exactly how much, and how little, the instruments could reach. All our knowledge of the external world, he observed, arrives in the same humble way. As messages, faint signals carried along the nerves to the seat of consciousness, where alone they become the vivid world we seem to live in. He compared the brain to a newspaper office in some remote outpost, receiving the day's events not directly, but as a stream of coded messages clicking in over the wire, which the editors then work up into a presentable story, complete and colorful and seemingly immediate, though not one of them has set foot at the scene. The world of solid colored things we appear to inhabit is, in this image, the finished newspaper. The actual external reality is only the coded signal, and beneath the code, the thing the signal is about, lies forever outside the office walls. By the methods of physics, Eddington concluded, we reach not a concrete reality but a shadow world of symbols, and feeling that there must be something more behind the symbols, he turned back to the one place where reality is given to us not as a remote inference, but directly, intimately, from within, our own consciousness. That, he suggested, was our single sample of the stuff behind the symbols, and so the only honest guess we could make about the rest was that it was, in some unimaginably broadened sense, of the same kind. We should be careful here, and Eddington and Jeans would be the first to insist on it. These were speculations, offered with a kind of humility, philosophical reflections gestured at from the edge of the science, rather than results proven within it. Most physicists then and since have set such musings aside as the private metaphysics of a few great minds, charming but not part of physics proper. And it is true that the new quantum theory, which seemed to some in those early years to dissolve solid matter into something stranger, does not by itself prove anything about consciousness. The question of how to interpret quantum mechanics is its own deep and unsettled debate, and most physicists today resist any direct leap from the puzzles of the quantum world to claims about mind. This is a place where great care is owed, because it is a place where loose thinking has often rushed in. It is sometimes said, in popular accounts, that quantum mechanics shows that consciousness creates reality, or that the mind of an observer collapses the wave of possibility into a single outcome. And from there, it is a short and tempting step to grand conclusions about a participatory, mind-infused universe. But this is to move far faster than physics allows. The role of the observer in quantum theory is genuinely puzzling and genuinely debated, and there are several competing interpretations of what the mathematics is telling us about the world, some of which give no special role to minds at all, treating the appearance of measurement as an ordinary physical interaction with no consciousness required. The honest situation is that physicists do not agree on what quantum mechanics means, and that none of the mainstream interpretations requires us to believe that human awareness reaches out and shapes the electron. To rest a case for the cosmic mind on the quantum measurement problem would be to build on sand. And so, the careful panpsychist does not. The deeper point Eddington was making does not depend on quantum mechanics at all. It is the older, quieter point about structure and intrinsic nature. The point Russell made, the point that all our physics, classical and quantum alike, describes the doing and is silent on the being. That silence is real, and it would be there even in a wholly classical world. The only question is what, if anything, fills it. The panpsychist offers one answer to that question, but there is a second argument, independent of the first, that has done much to keep the idea alive. And it comes from a contemporary philosopher named Galen Strawson, in an essay he published in 2006 with a provocative title, Realistic Monism, with the subtitle, Why Physicalism Entails Panpsychism. Strawson's argument is bracing in its directness, and it turns on a single principle about how things come to be. Strawson says, by taking consciousness seriously, by granting what seems undeniable, that experience is real, that the felt quality of your inner life genuinely exists and is not some illusion to be explained away. Call this realism about experience. Now add a second commitment, the commitment of the serious physicalist, that everything in the world, including consciousness, is ultimately a physical phenomenon, that we are made of the same matter as the stars and obey the same laws. Strawson accepts both of these. He insists, a thoroughgoing physicalist. He believes consciousness is wholly physical. But then he presses on a principle that he thinks any careful thinker must accept. For certain things, he argues, you simply cannot get them from their absence. You cannot get something from nothing. More precisely, you cannot have a kind of property emerge, genuinely and from scratch, from a reality that contains absolutely no trace of it. If you start with a world that is, in its fundamental nature, entirely and utterly without any experience whatsoever, not even the faintest spark of inwardness, then no rearrangement of that wholly experience-free stuff, however clever, however complex, can ever produce experience. You can shuffle dead matter into any pattern you like, build it into nervous systems of staggering intricacy, and all you will ever have is more dead matter in a more elaborate arrangement. The lights will never come on, because there was nothing there for them to come on from. This kind of supposed appearance of something genuinely new from a base that contains no trace of it, Strawson calls radical emergence, and he regards it as not merely mysterious but unintelligible, a kind of magic dressed up as science. We accept many ordinary cases of emergence without trouble. Liquidity emerges from water molecules that are not themselves liquid. The wetness of water is a new property of the collection, but Strawson argues, in such cases the new property is fully explicable in terms of the old ones, fully derivable from the behavior of the parts. Once you understand how the molecules move and interact, the liquidity follows with no remainder, no leftover mystery. Experience is not like this. There is no account, not even in principle, by which the felt redness of red follows with no remainder from facts about wholly unfeeling matter. The redness seems to be something genuinely additional. And to get something genuinely additional from a base that has no trace of it is exactly the magic he rejects. And so Strawson concludes, with a logic that he presents as almost forced upon him, that if you are a real physicalist, if you truly believe that experience is real and that it is wholly physical, then you must accept that the physical, at its base, was never wholly without experience. The fundamental stuff of the world, the matter from which brains are eventually built, must already carry some trace of experientiality, however faint, because otherwise there is no honest way to get from there to here. Physicalism, taken seriously, leads to panpsychism. The conclusion is startling, and many philosophers have argued against the principle it rests on, the rejection of radical emergence. That is precisely where the debate lives, but the argument has a clean and stubborn power, and it explains why even some hard-headed thinkers, suspicious of anything that sounds like mysticism, have found themselves drawn, almost against their will, toward the old idea that mind goes all the way down. Strawson liked to add a further twist that turns the usual charge of extravagance on its head. The objection most people raise against panpsychism is that it multiplies entities needlessly, conjuring experience into electrons where none is needed. But consider, Strawson says, what we are actually certain of. The one thing each of us knows beyond any possible doubt is that experience exists, because we are living it. It is the most immediate fact there is. What we do not directly know, what we only infer, is that there exists any wholly non-experiential stuff at all. Any matter that is, in its intrinsic nature, utterly without an inside. Ordinary physics is silent on that intrinsic nature, as we have seen. And so the existence of purely dead, experience-free matter is not something we observe, but something we assume. From this angle, the panpsychist is the parsimonious one, positing only the kind of stuff we already know to exist, experiential stuff, and declining to add a second, wholly hidden, never observed kind of utterly mindless substance on top of it. Whether that reversal succeeds is, again, hotly disputed, and most philosophers think something has gone wrong somewhere in it. But it is a genuinely clever move, and it shows that the question of which view is the strange, extravagant one, and which the sober and economical one, is far less obvious than it first appears. If we follow that idea, even just to see where it leads, it changes the way the long history of the cosmos looks. Let us walk back through that history slowly, in the dark, and watch what happens to the question of mind. You are made of atoms, and those atoms have a history far older than the Earth. The hydrogen in the water of your body is very nearly as old as the universe itself, forged in the first few minutes after the beginning, when the whole cosmos was a hot, dense fire cooling fast enough to let the simplest nuclei form. But the heavier atoms, the carbon that forms the backbone of every molecule in your brain, the oxygen you breathe, the iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones. None of these existed in the early universe at all. They were made later, and they were made in stars. Deep in the cores of stars, under pressures and temperatures almost beyond imagining, lighter atoms are pressed together into heavier ones. Hydrogen fused into helium, helium built up into carbon and oxygen, and in the most massive stars, on up the ladder toward iron. And when those great stars reach the end of their lives and collapse and tear themselves apart in the blaze of a supernova, they fling these newly made elements out into space, seeding the clouds of gas from which new stars and new worlds, and eventually living things, will form. Every carbon atom in every thought you have ever had was cooked in the heart of a star that died before the sun was born, and drifted for ages through the dark, and gathered at last into the cloud that became our solar system, and worked its way up through rock and sea, and cell into the particular arrangement that is you. Listening now in the quiet, sit with the slowness of that, for it is a story told in the longest of times. A massive star may burn steadily for some millions of years, fusing its way through one fuel, and then the next, building heavier and heavier elements in shells around its core like the rings of an onion, until at the very center it has made iron, and iron will yield no more energy by fusing, and the great engine that had held the star up against its own weight falls, suddenly silent. In that instant, the core collapses, and the outer layers, with nothing left to hold them, fall inward and rebound in a single titanic outflow that, for a few weeks, can shine more brightly than all the other stars of its galaxy combined. And then the light fades, and the forged elements drift outward into the dark, a slowly cooling, slowly thinning cloud, mingling over millions of years with the gas and dust between the stars, until somewhere, perhaps stirred by the shockwave of yet another distant death, a patch of that enriched cloud grows dense enough to begin, under its own gravity, to collapse and warm and turn, and a new star ignites at its center, with a disk of leftover matter wheeling around it. And in that disk, the heavy atoms gather into grains, and the grains into rocks, and the rocks into worlds. The matter does not hurry. It has all the time there is. From the death of one star to the kindling of the next can be tens of millions of years. From the kindling of a star to the appearance, on one of its worlds, of anything that could be called a mind, billions more. The whole of it unfolds in a silence and a darkness, and a patience that the human imagination can gesture toward, but never quite hold. This is one of the established and genuinely moving facts of modern astronomy, and on the ordinary story, it is already beautiful enough. The matter of your mind was made by stars. In a real and literal sense, the brain is a way the universe has of folding old starlight back upon itself until it begins to feel. But notice how the panpsychist hears this same story, and how the emphasis shifts. On the ordinary account, the atoms came from the star's entirely mindless, mere bookkeeping of protons and neutrons, and consciousness was added only at the very end, when the atoms were finally arranged into a brain, conjured into being by the arrangement itself. On the panpsychist account, there is no such late conjuring, because there was nothing to conjure from nothing. The faint inwardness was always there, carried along with the matter through every furnace and every cold drift between the stars. The long history of cosmic chemistry, the slow building of heavier and heavier elements, was not the creation of mind out of mindlessness, but only the gathering and concentrating and organizing of an experientiality that the universe had possessed in scattered and simple form from the start. The brain, on this view, does not generate consciousness any more than a river generates water. It collects it, channels it, gives it form and unity and richness, draws the faint, diffuse spark of the parts up into the bright, complex flame of a single experiencing mind. And so the panpsychist invites us to run the history of the universe backward and ask a question that, on the ordinary account, has a strange and abrupt answer. When, exactly, did the lights come on? Trace the lineage of consciousness back down the generations, from human beings to earlier mammals, from mammals to the first simple animals, with the first simple nervous systems, back through the long age when the only life was single cells in ancient seas, back before life, entirely to the lifeless chemistry of the young Earth, back before the Earth to the cloud of gas and dust, back before that to the deaths of earlier stars, back and back toward the beginning, somewhere along that line, on the ordinary account, there must be a threshold, a moment or a level of complexity at which experience suddenly appears where before there was none. The first dim flicker of feeling in a universe that had been entirely in the dark for billions of years. But where is that threshold, and why there? Why should a particular arrangement of utterly unfeeling matter be the one that, crossing some invisible line, begins for the first time to feel? The panpsychist presses this as the central embarrassment of the ordinary view. There seems to be no principled place to draw the line, no non-arbitrary moment at which the inside of the world switches on. And the panpsychist's own answer is to deny that there is any such threshold at all. The lights did not come on because they were never entirely off. There was always some faint glow, dimming as you go down and back, but never reaching pure dark, all the way to the beginning. The defender of the ordinary view, of course, has a reply, and it should be heard, for it is the reply most scientists would give. There are many things in nature, they point out, that genuinely come into being only at a certain level of complexity, and we do not find this troubling. There is no liquidity in a single water molecule, yet water is wet. There is no life in a single atom of carbon or oxygen, yet arrange enough of the right molecules in the right way, and you have a living cell. Why should consciousness not be the same? A property that simply appears when matter is organized into the particular dynamic patterns we find in brains, no more mysterious in principle than wetness or life, appearing when their conditions are met. On this view, the demand for a precise threshold is misplaced. Consciousness need not switch on at a single sharp instant any more than wetness does, but may shade in gradually as nervous systems grow more capable, with no embarrassment and no magic. The panpsychist answers, as we have seen, that consciousness is unlike wetness and life in one crucial respect, that wetness and life can be fully derived from the behavior of their parts with no felt remainder, whereas felt experience cannot. And so, the comparison breaks down at exactly the point that matters. And there the argument sits, unresolved, each side convinced the other has missed the decisive thing. It is a genuine disagreement between thoughtful people, not a settled question with a contrarian holdout, and an honest account has to leave it open. There is also a subtler ancestor of all these views worth naming, for it shows how slippery the ground is even for the people who tend it. Russell himself, and before him the philosopher and psychologist William James, were drawn at times to a position called neutral monism, the idea that the ultimate stuff of the world is neither mental nor physical, but some third thing, neutral between them, of which mind and matter are simply two different arrangements or two different ways of being known. On this telling, experience and physical structure are not one fundamental and the other derived. They are two faces of a deeper reality that is, in itself, neither. Whether such a neutral ground is really coherent, or whether it collapses on inspection back into one side or the other, has been argued over for a century, and Russell's own views drifted across the years. The point worth carrying away into the dark is only that the space of serious positions here is wider and more finely shaded than the simple contest between physicalism and panpsychism suggests, and that some of the most careful minds who ever lived spent decades among these distinctions without ever feeling they had reached firm bottom. Go all the way back, then in the panpsychist's company, to the earliest moments we can speak of with confidence. For its first few 100,000 years, the universe was so hot and dense that it was opaque, a glowing fog of particles and radiation in which light could not travel freely. Then, when the cosmos was around 380,000 years old, it had cooled enough for the first atoms to form and the fog to clear, releasing the light that still bathes the whole sky as a faint cold glow. The cosmic microwave background, the oldest light there is, the afterglow of the beginning that our instruments can still detect coming from every direction. After that clearing came a long stretch of darkness that astronomers, with unusual poetry, call the cosmic dark ages. The fog had lifted, but there were as yet no stars to light the new transparency, only a vast and cooling sea of hydrogen and helium drifting in the dark, settling slowly under gravity into the faint beginnings of structure. For something like a few 100 million years, the universe simply waited, growing colder, the great clouds gathering and thickening, until at last, in the densest knots, the first stars ignited, and light returned to the cosmos for the first time since the primordial fire. That moment, the cosmic dawn, lit the universe anew, and from those first stars and the galaxies that grew around them, generation upon generation, the long enrichment of matter began, the slow forging of the heavier elements out of which, in the fullness of time, and on at least one small world feeling things would eventually be made. On the ordinary account, that early universe was utterly without mind, a vast unfeeling fire, and would remain so through all the dark ages and long after the first stars kindled, until, far later, the first feeling thing stirred on some unknown world. On the panpsychist account, even that primordial fire was not wholly dark on its inner side. Even there, in the simplest particles of the cooling cosmos, there was already the faintest trace of experientiality, present from almost the first instant, a universe that has never, on this telling, been entirely without an inside. Whether that thought is profound or merely a confusion is exactly what is in dispute. But it is, at least, a way of looking at the long, cold history of the cosmos that leaves no awkward moment of magical switching on, no instant at which the impossible is asked to happen. We have now seen the case for the idea, and it is, in its way, a strong and elegant case. But we promised honesty, and honesty requires that we turn now and face the great difficulty, the objection that hangs over panpsychism like a heavy sky, the problem its critics return to again and again, and that its defenders have wrestled with for decades without anything like complete success. It is called the combination problem, and it is worth understanding clearly, because it is the place where the whole beautiful edifice threatens to come apart. Suppose we grant, for the sake of following the thought, that the fundamental particles carry some tiny spark of experience, each one a minute, an isolated center of faint inwardness. Your brain contains an astronomical number of such particles. The question is simply this: how do all those tiny separate sparks combine into the single, unified, rich experience that is your consciousness right now? When you look at the night sky, you do not have billions of tiny disconnected micro-experiences, one for each particle in your visual system. You have one experience, a single seamless field, the whole sweep of stars present together to one unified you. Where did that unity come from? How do many little subjects, each with its own faint private inwardness, merge into one big subject that takes them all up into a single point of view? It is not at all obvious that they can. Experiences, after all, seem to be essentially private, essentially tied to a particular subject. My experience is mine, and yours is yours, and they do not simply add together into a third shared experience belonging to a larger combined being. Two people standing side by side, each conscious, do not thereby produce a third consciousness hovering between them that experiences both their minds at once. So why should two particles, or 2 trillion of them, do any better? The micro-experiences seem to stay stubbornly separate no matter how you arrange them. And the unified macro-experience of a human mind seems to be something genuinely new, something that does not simply follow from the experiences of the parts. Dwell on how peculiar that unity is, the thing the combination problem despairs of explaining. At this very moment, your experience is not a heap of fragments loosely piled together. It is a single whole. The faint sounds around you, the dark behind your eyelids, the weight of your body against the bed, the drift of your own thoughts, all of these are present together, bound into one field belonging to one experiencing self. There are not many little yous, one for each sense, one for each region of the brain reporting in. There is one you, and everything is present to that one. Now ask how that could be assembled out of parts. Suppose each cell, each molecule, each particle in your brain has its own tiny private experience, sealed within itself. Stacking them side by side, however many of them and however tightly packed, seems only to give you a vast crowd of tiny private experiences, each still sealed, each still its own, like a stadium full of people who never speak. A crowd of separate inner lives is not the same as a single larger inner life that takes them all up at once. We have, in ordinary life, no example of small experiences merging into one greater experience. My experience and yours do not pool into a third that has both. That is precisely why I cannot feel your headache, and you cannot taste what I taste. Experience seems to come sealed, one subject to a customer, and if it is sealed at the human scale, the critic asks, why on earth should it be unsealed at the scale of particles, so that trillions of them could melt together into the single seamless self that is now drifting toward sleep? And here is the sharp turn of the knife, the reason the combination problem is so damaging. Recall that the whole appeal of panpsychism was that it promised to avoid radical emergence, to avoid the magic of getting experience from no experience. But if it cannot explain how small experiences combine into large unified ones, then it has only replaced one mystery with another. Instead of asking how feeling emerges from the unfeeling, we are now asking how unified feeling emerges from scattered little feelings. And that second emergence looks every bit as mysterious as the first. If it is magic to get a mind from mindless parts, it seems hardly less magical to get one mind from many tiny separate minds. The critic puts it bluntly. Panpsychism claimed to dissolve the hard problem, but the hard problem has simply reappeared one level down, wearing a new disguise. Galen Strawson, who pressed the case for panpsychism so forcefully, conceded the depth of this difficulty and could offer little more than a hope that there exist some laws of experiential composition we do not yet understand, governing how little experiences sum into large ones. But to name the problem and hope for a future law is not to solve it, and his critics were quick to say so. The combination problem is, by wide agreement, the single greatest obstacle the view faces, and no proposed solution has won anything like general acceptance. It is in response to this difficulty that some philosophers have made a startling move, a kind of inversion of the whole picture, and it is here that the idea reconnects most directly with the cosmos as a whole. The thought runs like this: the combination problem arises because we started at the bottom, with the tiny particles, and tried to build consciousness upward by adding their little experiences together. That is what philosophers sometimes call the smallest assumption, the assumption that the real action is always at the smallest scale, and that everything larger is built up out of the small. But what if we have it backward? What if, instead of starting with the many tiny minds and trying to combine them, we start with one great mind, the mind of the whole, and work downward? This is the view that has come to be called cosmopsychism, and its most prominent recent defender is the British philosopher Philip Goff, who laid it out in detail in a book published in 2017 called Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. On the cosmopsychist picture, the fundamental conscious thing is not the particle but the cosmos itself, taken as a single whole. The universe, on this view, is the one basic subject of experience, and everything within it, including you and me and every other conscious creature, is not a building block from which the cosmic mind is assembled, but rather an aspect, a fragment, a partial perspective grounded in and carved out of that one great consciousness. The smaller minds are not the foundation. They are derivative, like eddies in a single vast current, like the individual notes that are abstractions from one continuous sound. Goff was drawn to this inversion in part precisely because it seemed to sidestep the combination problem. If you do not start with separate little subjects, then you never face the impossible task of welding them together. The unity comes first, built into the cosmos from the start, and the apparent separateness of individual minds is the thing to be explained rather than the thing you start from. There is something here that resonates with the very oldest images we met at the beginning, with the Stoic vision of a single living universe held together by one diffused rational principle, with Plato's world soul woven through the turning heavens. The cosmopsychist has, in a sense, returned to the anima mundi by a long and rigorous road, arriving at the idea of one great cosmic mind not through poetry or religion, but through the dry pressure of an argument about how experiences combine. And it gives the dark sky a different feeling again. On this view, the unimaginable vastness above us, the 2 trillion or so galaxies, though the true number remains genuinely uncertain, and recent estimates have argued it may be considerably lower, perhaps only hundreds of billions, the 100 billion stars in our own galaxy alone. The whole immense and silent structure stretching across some 90 billion light-years of observable space would not be a mindless backdrop against which a few small minds happen to flicker. It would be, on its inner side, one consciousness, of which every flickering small mind is a momentary partial expression, the universe experiencing itself locally through each creature that ever opened its eyes. There is a strange comfort and a strange vertigo in holding that thought, even just as a possibility, even just for the span of a quiet night. The comfort is in the company it offers. If the cosmopsychist is right, then the loneliness we began with, the sense of a few warm minds scattered impossibly thin across a cold and indifferent immensity, would be an illusion born of looking only at the surface. The cold and the distance would be real, but the indifference would not, for the whole would be, in its depths, a single experiencing thing, and no part of it would be truly outside or alone, and the vertigo is in the scale of the self such a view proposes. A subject whose body is the entire observable universe, whose slow thoughts, if it has anything like thoughts, would unfold across billions of years and billions of light years, and to whom a human life, a human civilization, the whole history of feeling on this one small world, might be less than the flicker of a single neuron is to us. Whether there is any truth in it, no one can say. But it is worth noticing that the idea, far from being a modern eccentricity, is in this respect the oldest idea of all, the one the Stoics held and Plato wrote into the Timaeus, and the old Hylozoists felt in their bones, that the cosmos is, somehow, a single living whole, and that we are not separate from it, but are, each of us, the universe briefly waking to itself in one small place. But we must not let the beauty of the image race ahead of the honesty we owe the subject, because cosmopsychism, for all its elegance, faces a difficulty that is the exact mirror image of the one it was meant to escape. If the bottom-up panpsychist struggles to explain how many small minds combine into one large mind, the top-down cosmopsychist struggles just as hard to explain the reverse, how the one great cosmic mind divides, or differentiates, into the many small private minds we actually find. This is called the decombination problem, or sometimes the problem of how the cosmic subject splits into separate perspectives, and it is no easier than the problem it replaces. If the universe is one unified consciousness, why do I have access only to my own narrow stream of experience, and not to yours, and not to the whole? How does a single, seamless cosmic experience come to be carved up into billions of sealed-off private points of view, each ignorant of the others, each feeling itself a separate self? Goff and others have proposed various answers, some of them quite ingenious and some reaching, intriguingly, toward the psychology of dissociation. There is a rare and striking condition in which a single human mind appears to fragment into several distinct centers of experience, each walled off from the others, so that one knows nothing, from the inside, of what the others undergo. Several seemingly separate selves housed within one brain. Some thinkers in this tradition have suggested that something analogous, raised to the scale of the cosmos, might be how the one great consciousness comes to appear as many, that each of us is, as it were, a dissociated region of the universal mind, a place where the whole has folded inward and lost sight of the rest of itself, so that it feels, from within that fold, like a small separate self gazing out at a world it takes to be other than itself. It is a haunting picture, and its proponents argue that it is no stranger than the alternatives. But none of these proposals has settled the matter, and critics point out, fairly, that the cosmopsychist has not so much solved the problem of how mind and multiplicity fit together, as moved it from one end of the scale to the other. To say that the one mind dissociates into many is to name the process, not yet to explain how, or why a unified experience could possibly come apart in that way. The combination problem and the decombination problem stand like two guardians at opposite gates, And the panpsychist, whichever way he turns, finds one of them barring the road. Philip Goff, in his more recent work, has pressed the idea in an even bolder direction, one that ties it directly to a famous puzzle in cosmology. And it is worth describing carefully, with the clear understanding that here we have left even the contested ground of mainstream panpsychism and entered the realm of one philosopher's frankly speculative proposal. In a book published in 2023, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, Goff takes up the much-discussed observation that the fundamental constants of physics, the precise strengths of the basic forces, the exact masses of the particles, appear to be remarkably finely balanced, in the sense that if they were even slightly different, the universe would apparently be incapable of producing stars, or chemistry, or any of the complex structures on which life depends. The examples cosmologists discuss have a certain eerie precision to them, where the strong nuclear force, which binds the particles in an atomic nucleus, a little stronger or a little weaker, the simple fusion reactions that power the stars and build the elements would run very differently, and the balance of light elements that emerged from the early universe would be thrown off. If gravity were tuned somewhat differently relative to the other forces, stars might burn too fast to allow long, stable ages, or fail to form at all. One celebrated case touches the very stardust we have been following. For carbon, the backbone of all known life, to be manufactured in stars at all, 3 helium nuclei must come together almost simultaneously, a process that would be vanishingly rare unless there happened to exist a particular excited state of the carbon nucleus, tuned to just the right energy, that makes the reaction resonate and proceed. The astronomer Fred Hoyle, reasoning that carbon plainly does exist in abundance and therefore must somehow be made, predicted that such an energy level had to be there before anyone had found it. And when physicists looked, the level was there, very near where it had to be. Hoyle was struck by the apparent felicity of it, and the episode has been cited ever since in discussions of cosmic fine-tuning, though physicists disagree about how much weight it can bear, and many regard it as a striking coincidence rather than evidence of anything deeper. This apparent fine-tuning of the constants for the possibility of life is a real and much debated feature of modern cosmology, and physicists offer several competing explanations for it. Some hold that it is a mere coincidence, that the constants simply are what they are, and we should not read meaning into it. Many favor the idea of a multiverse, a vast or infinite collection of universes with different constants, in which it is no surprise that we find ourselves in one of the rare life-permitting ones, since those are the only ones in which observers could exist to wonder about it. These are the standard scientific responses, and they remain the responses most cosmologists prefer. Goff's proposal is different and far more controversial. He suggests that the fine-tuning might be explained if the cosmos itself is, in some minimal sense, a value-responding agent, a conscious whole that was in some way disposed toward the realization of value, toward the eventual flowering of life and mind. This is what he calls a teleological form of cosmopsychism, teleological meaning purpose-directed, oriented toward an end. It is, by any measure, a radical and highly speculative idea, and it should be heard as exactly that, the bold conjecture of one philosopher, not a finding of science. The great majority of physicists and philosophers do not accept it. They regard the multiverse, or simple brute fact, as far more economical explanations of fine-tuning than the proposal that the universe harbors purposes. We mention it not because it is likely true, but because it shows how far the underlying idea can be pushed, and how the ancient dream of a cosmos shot through with mind, and even with purpose has found its way, in our own time, back into serious, if very much minority discussion. It is the world soul of the Timaeus, returned in the strange new dress of fine-tuning arguments and the metaphysics of consciousness. There is also a scientific cousin to all of this, a theory that grew up not in philosophy departments but in neuroscience, and that has drawn panpsychism and the laboratory into uneasy contact. It is called integrated information theory, and it was first developed in the early 2000s by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, later joined by the well-known neuroscientist Christoph Koch. The theory is ambitious and mathematical. It proposes that consciousness is identical to a certain kind of integrated information, a measure of how richly the parts of a system are bound together, so that the whole carries more information than the parts considered separately. This measure is given a name, the Greek letter phi, and the theory holds, roughly, that a system is conscious to the degree that it has a high value of phi, that its information is genuinely integrated rather than merely scattered among independent pieces. The theory was designed with the human brain in mind, and it has been used to try to explain why some parts of the brain seem central to consciousness and others not, and why consciousness fades in dreamless sleep and under anesthesia. The theory grew, in part, out of a simple and suggestive observation about our own experience. Every conscious moment is at once enormously rich, distinguishing itself from countless other possible moments, and yet entirely unified, experienced all at once as a single whole that cannot be cleanly divided into separate parts. A photograph stored in a camera contains a great deal of information, but it is not integrated. You could cut it into pieces and lose nothing of how each piece behaves. A conscious experience, the theory says, is different. Its information cannot be carved up without destroying it, because the whole is bound together in a way the parts alone are not. The quantity phi is meant to capture exactly this, the surplus of the whole over its separated parts, the degree to which a system is, informationally, more than the sum of its pieces. Where phi is high, the theory proposes, there is consciousness. Where a system can be split apart with no loss into components that carry on just as before, there is little or none. In recent years, the theory has even been put to the test against rival accounts of consciousness in a large, carefully designed contest, an adversarial collaboration in which proponents of competing theories agreed in advance on experiments whose results might favor one side or the other. An unusual and admirable attempt to bring a hard empirical edge to questions that so often float free of evidence. But integrated information theory has a striking consequence that pulls it toward the territory we have been exploring. If consciousness just is integrated information, then any system with the right kind of integrated information, brain or not, would be conscious to some degree. And integrated information, on the theory's own terms, is not confined to brains. Even very simple physical systems may have some small non-zero value of phi. This means the theory implies that consciousness, in faint degrees, may be far more widespread in the universe than common sense supposes, present wherever information is integrated, which is to say nearly everywhere. The theory thus comes close, by a wholly different route, to a kind of panpsychism, arriving at the ubiquity of mind not through metaphysical argument, but through a mathematical definition built in a neuroscience lab. For a time, the theory was treated, in much of the press, as among the leading scientific accounts of consciousness, discussed respectfully and tested against the brain. And then, in the autumn of 2023, there was an unusual public quarrel that is worth recounting, because it shows just how raw and unsettled this whole field remains. In September of that year, an open letter appeared, signed by well over 100 researchers in consciousness science, more than 120 in all, and it leveled a severe charge. It called integrated information theory, in effect, pseudoscience, arguing that whatever its mathematical sophistication, the theory had not been properly tested, and perhaps could not be properly tested, that its grand claims outran the evidence. The label was a harsh one, and it landed like a thunderclap in a small and previously collegial field. Supporters of the theory were stunned. The philosopher David Chalmers, who had treated the theory with respect, though he did not fully endorse it, compared the letter to dropping a nuclear bomb over a regional dispute. Prominent figures rushed to the theory's defense, and other prominent figures defended the letter. And the argument spilled across journals, social media, and the science pages of newspapers. Notably, when researchers in the field were surveyed, only a small minority were willing to fully endorse the harsh pseudoscience label. And the criticism was echoed again in a commentary in a leading neuroscience journal a couple of years later. The dispute has not been resolved. It stands as a reminder, a useful one for us, that the science of consciousness is young and contested and far from any settled consensus, and that the questions we have been turning over in the dark are not idle ones, but live and burning issues among the people who study the mind for a living. Which brings us, in fairness, to the critics of panpsychism itself, who deserve a full and respectful hearing, because they are many and they are formidable. And the honest truth is that they hold the majority view. The first and most basic objection is the one about evidence and testability. Science, at its best, proceeds by proposing claims that the world could in principle prove wrong, claims that stick their necks out and make predictions that can be checked. The trouble with panpsychism, the critic says, is that it appears to make no such checkable predictions at all. If a faint experience accompanies every particle, this faint experience does nothing, changes no measurement, alters no equation. The physics of the electron is exactly the same whether or not there is some dim inwardness on its hidden side. And if the claim makes no observable difference, how could we ever gather evidence for or against it? It seems to float free of any possible test, neither confirmable nor refutable, and a claim that nothing could ever count against is, many would argue, not a scientific claim at all, however interesting it may be as metaphysics. The panpsychist has a reply, of course, that the existence of consciousness in ourselves is itself a datum, the most certain datum we have, and that the question is which overall theory best accounts for it. But the worry about testability is real, and it is widely shared, and it keeps many careful thinkers at arm's length from the whole enterprise. Then there is the objection from sheer incredulity, which is less an argument than a reaction, but which carries real force nonetheless. To a great many philosophers and scientists, the idea that an electron has even the faintest glimmer of experience simply seems absurd on its face, an extravagant claim for which we have no good reason, and against which our full understanding of how minds depend on brains seems to cry out. The philosopher John Searle, a major figure in the field, called panpsychism absurd and said there was not the slightest reason to adopt it. The philosopher Colin Maginn called it metaphysically and scientifically outrageous. These are not careful refutations. They are expressions of what philosophers sometimes wryly call the incredulous stare, the response of a reasonable person confronted with a claim that strikes them as too strange to take seriously. The panpsychist answers that strangeness is not falsehood, that many true things about the universe have seemed outrageous before we got used to them, that relativity and quantum mechanics both violated common sense and turned out to be true, and that all the rival theories of mind are, in their own ways, just as revisionary and just as hard to believe. Goff himself has made exactly this point, that physicalism, with its promise to explain felt experience as mere mechanism, is no less a violation of our ordinary picture than panpsychism is. There is something to this, but the incredulous stare endures all the same, and it is part of why the view remains, and may always remain, a minority position. It is worth giving the other side its strongest voice here, in fairness, because the largest body of opinion does not merely stare in disbelief, but offers a confident alternative. Most who study the brain hold that consciousness will, in the end, be explained the way every other biological marvel has been explained, by understanding the mechanism in ever finer detail, and that the sense of a further, unanswerable hard problem is itself the thing to be explained away rather than honored. On this view, there is no extra ingredient missing from the physical story. There is only a stubborn intuition, deeply built into us, that there must be something more, and that intuition can mislead. Some philosophers, notably Daniel Dennett, press this further still, into a position sometimes called illusionism, which holds that the very felt qualities we take to be so undeniable, the seeming redness and the seeming ache, are something like a user interface the brain presents to itself, a useful representation that we mistake for a deep metaphysical fact. On this account, the hard problem is not solved so much as dissolved, shown to rest on a confusion about our own inner access. Many find this reply unsatisfying, feeling that it explains everything except the one thing that mattered, the having of the experience itself. But many others find it exactly right, and regard the whole apparatus of qualia and the hard problem as a wrong turn. The point to hold on to, lying here in the dark, is that there is no consensus. The wisest people who have spent their lives on these questions disagree, profoundly and in good faith, about whether there is even a problem here for panpsychism to solve. And there are further objections worth naming. There is a related and quite different family of views called idealism, defended in our own time by thinkers such as Bernardo Kastrup, which agrees with the panpsychist that mind is fundamental, but goes further still, holding that mind is not just one ingredient of reality, but the only ingredient, that the entire physical world is in some sense a structure within a more basic consciousness, and that individual minds like ours are something like dissociated fragments of that one universal mind, much as a single person, in rare conditions, can fracture into separate selves. Idealism shares panpsychism's starting conviction and presses it to a more thoroughgoing conclusion, and it brings its own difficulties and its own defenders, and the boundary between sophisticated panpsychism and sophisticated idealism can grow quite thin. We mention it only to mark that the landscape of views taking consciousness to be fundamental is wider and more various than any single label suggests, and that within it, there is vigorous internal disagreement about exactly how mind and matter are related. disagreement at least as sharp as the disagreement with the physicalists outside. It is striking, when one steps back, how stubbornly these questions resist us, and how little real progress has been made on the central mystery in all the centuries since Thales looked at a lodestone and wondered whether it had a soul. We have learned almost unimaginably much in the meantime. We have measured the bending of starlight and the age of the cosmos, and the recipes by which stars cook the elements. We have traced the wiring of the brain in exquisite detail and watched, in living color, which of its regions light up as a person sees or remembers or decides. And yet the oldest question of all, why any of this dazzling machinery should be accompanied by an inner light, by a felt experience, by there being someone home, sits almost exactly where it sat 2,500 years ago, untouched by all our instruments, because it is not the kind of thing an instrument can reach. Every measurement we make is a measurement of structure and behavior, of the outside of things, and the question is about the inside. That may be why the question has the particular flavor it does, half scientific and half something older and quieter, and why it tends to surface most insistently not in the laboratory, but at night, alone under the stars, when the machinery of the day falls silent, and there is nothing left but the bare fact of being aware. Perhaps it will be solved one day, and our descendants will look back on our puzzlement the way we look back on those who could not see why the planets wandered. Or perhaps it is the kind of question that does not get solved so much as lived with, a permanent companion to a creature that can ask what it is and never quite answer. Where does all of this leave us, lying in the dark, with the silence of the cosmos pressing in from every side? It leaves us, honestly, without an answer, and there is a kind of peace to be found in admitting that plainly. We do not know whether the mind is woven through the fabric of the universe, or whether it is a rare, late flame kindled only in the intricate wiring of certain rare warm things. We do not know whether the stars have, on their hidden inner side, the faintest trace of an experience, or whether they are exactly as dark within as they appear from without. We do not know whether, when you turn your face up to the night sky, the universe is in some small way turning to look back, or whether the looking runs entirely in one direction, a mind gazing out at a vast, unfeeling structure that gazes at nothing. These are among the deepest questions there are, and they are, at present, genuinely open. The hard problem of consciousness, which set us on this path, remains unsolved by every party to the dispute. The physicalist has not explained how feeling arises from the unfeeling. The panpsychist has not explained how the little feelings combine, nor the cosmopsychist how the great feeling divides. The science of the matter is young and quarrelsome, and far from any resting place. We are, all of us, still in the early dark, holding a small light and able to see only a little way ahead. But there is something worth holding on to in the not knowing. And it is the thing that drew the old philosophers to the question in the first place, and the thing that draws careful thinkers back to it now. It is the simple, astonishing fact that the question can be asked at all. Whatever consciousness finally turns out to be, however far down it does or does not reach, here it indisputably is, in this corner of the cosmos, in the listening that is happening right now in the dark. After all the billions of years of cooling fire and forming stars and drifting dust, after all the long ages in which, on any account, the universe contained no one to notice it, there came to be at least this one place where the universe is known from the inside, where there is something it is like to exist, where the silence between the stars is heard as silence by something that can be moved by it. Perhaps that inwardness was always there in faint form, present in every particle since the beginning. Perhaps it appeared only recently and locally, a brief candle in an enormous darkness. Either way, it is here. The cosmos, in us at least, has an inside. And that fact, that there is anyone at all to wonder whether the stars might wonder, is strange and quiet and large enough to rest in for a long while. So let the stars turn, as they have turned for ages and will turn for ages more, slowly, without hurry, indifferent or perhaps not entirely indifferent to the small, warm mind that watches them. Let the great galaxies wheel in their immense, unhurried way, drifting apart across a darkness that has no edges. Let the old light of dead stars arrive at last, having crossed the long, cold distances, to fall softly on a single pair of closing eyes. Whether or not there is an inside to all that vastness, there is an inside to this, to the quiet settling of a mind toward sleep, to the slow loosening of thought, to the gentle dissolving of the day into the dark. The universe is mostly silent, mostly dark, mostly nothing at all. And yet within it, for a little while, there is this. There is something it is like to be here, drifting toward rest, beneath the slow and patient turning of the stars. The questions will keep. They have kept for 26 centuries, and they will keep until morning. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to settle, nothing to hold on to. Only the long dark and the faint distant light, and the slow turning and the silence, and the strange quiet wonder that there is anyone here at all to feel it fade. Rest now. Let the great wheel turn. Let the light come from far away and ask nothing of you. Let the questions drift off into the dark like cooling embers carried out on a slow wind, growing dimmer, growing fainter, settling at last into the long silence between the stars. If these slow journeys through the dark are a comfort to you, and you would like more of them to drift to sleep beneath, you are welcome to follow along and to leave a quiet sign that you passed this way, so that more of these long nights among the stars can find their way to you. But there is no hurry in that, and none in anything now. For now, there is only the dark and the turning and the rest that is waiting. Sleep well beneath the patient and unhurried stars.